The firing squads made victims dig their own graves before they were shot. In one grainy 30-second loop of footage that shows continuously on a TV monitor, Jewish prisoners are unloaded from a truck in front of a large group of spectators, some of whom are smoking and chatting. The Jews, confused and unresisting, are herded into a large shallow pit and gunned down by a firing squad. A pet dog, frightened by the gunfire, runs through the frame and is comforted by its owner. I watch it again and again, the same grainy loop, genocide's Groundhog Day. The Jews are unloaded from a truck, the audience smokes and chats, the rifles fire, the Jews fall dead in a heap, the little dog bolts, its owner gathers it into his arms and comforts it. On the museum wall dedicated to the concentration camps are some magnified quotes from the diaries of inmates. One is written from Treblinka, which is where my relatives ended up. It goes like this: we secretly placed in the walls of the graves whole skeletons, and we wrote on scraps of paper what the Germans were doing at Treblinka. We put the scraps of paper into bottles, which we placed next to the skeletons. Our intention was that if one day someone looked for traces of the Nazis' crimes, they could indeed be found. The writer's name is Goldfarb, Abraham Goldfarb. Goldfarb's secret message in a bottle feels like a personal rebuke. It turns out, by the way, that that's my original Jewish name, which is why it resonated with me. Even as he faced death, he reached out to speak to future generations. I phoned my mother and asked her whether we might now discuss my father's family history. In fact, he's been working on a letter to you, she says. Soon a letter does arrive from my father. Only it's not a letter as such, it's a family tree, meticulously plotted in his draftsman's hand on sheets of graph paper taped together. They fold out like an expanding concertina, an intricate origami of our origin. It goes back 5 generations, and many of the names have footnote numbers by them, 14 footnotes in all. I notice he has referred to himself cryptically by the initials of his assumed name, G.G., George Godwin, and has deliberately omitted his birth date. Footnote number 8 is marked next to his name, but the footnotes themselves are not enclosed. They arrive a few weeks later, mailed only after I have confirmed receipt of the family tree. And basically what he does is he shows me the family tree, and in many of them they end in an X where they've been killed in concentration camps. Excuse me. You read one little bit more of this, and then I'll skip on. What he asked me to do was actually put out a Red Cross tracing form, because he wanted to try and find out if there was anything he could do. Because I found in these situations that people, what they really do want is closure, which is one thing that in many respects a concentration camp didn't offer relatives. I used to think that we white Africans were hard to sympathize with because we were that least defensible of constituencies, the unwronged. Now I am having thrust upon me the poisoned chalice of historic victimhood. But notwithstanding Abraham Goldfarb's hidden bottle, the hemlock of the Holocaust is not something I wish to drink. I know that Jews call the Holocaust the Shoah, which in Hebrew means catastrophe. I dimly recall reading Anne Frank's diary as a child. I once read Primo Levi's account of Auschwitz. I saw Schindler's List. I studied the Nuremberg trials in history, but it really wasn't something I had dwelled on in any detail. Holocaust, holocostum. From 8 years of schoolboy Latin, I know it meant whole burned whole. Even the phoenix of Zionism that rose from those ashes, the muscular Sabras trying to re-establish a home in an unforgiving land surrounded by hostile Arabs, resonated too closely with my white African narrative. The parallels with South Africa in particular seemed uncanny. Israelis were building barriers to separate themselves from those who had threatened them, just as white Africans had tried to do. Both had created odd-shaped artificial homelands, isolated dust bowls for those they had displaced, and said to the Palestinians or to blacks, live there and rule yourselves, you are no longer a subject people. The Red Cross writes back to acknowledge my tracing requests, saying that it will take at least a year for them to be processed. And a few days later, our second son, Hugo, is born. We give him George as a second name, George after my father, George, which is English for Jersey, his original name. I phone my parents to give them news of their grandchild. My father comes on the line, and we talk of the baby for a while, and then I tell him that I've sent off his tracing inquiry to the Red Cross. It is the first time we have ever referred directly to his real past. There is a pause on the line, and then he says gruffly, "Thanks. Do you think you could tell me more about it all?" I say. "Well, Pete," he says, his voice now flat and guarded, "I'll try. What do you want to know?" I struggle to keep the exasperation out of my voice. What do I want to know? Who you are, Dad. I want to know who you are. And so, as an old man now, my father tries to reintroduce himself to his own son, finally acknowledging his real identity, hidden from the world for half a century. Eventually, I receive an email from him. It is headed, "My Life History, Part 1, Childhood." My mother says he has been working on it for months, sitting at the computer for hours at a time, staring at the screen between little bursts of two-fingered typing, while she pads in and out with trays of coffee and sandwiches. It's so hard, Peter, after all this time, he says. I find it quite amazing how little I remember. It is as if my father has made so few forays into the hidden landscape of his past that the neural pathway leading to these memories are choked with foliage, just as a footpath in Africa disappears soon after the people stop walking there. His emails read like reports from an archaeological dig, little random shards of a reconstructed life, the barest facts shorn of their emotional content. He is finally trying to discard a mask, and yet it seems that when he peels it off, he cannot easily access what's underneath. The mask, the superimposed visage that he has shown the world, this concocted exterior, has become his only reality. It is more than just a mask. It is a suit of armour that hasn't been shed for so long it has fused onto the milky body within, the body it was fabricated to protect. He has thought and thought about it, sitting in front of that computer screen in his room in Africa, looking out onto the gaudy tropical garden and bright African birds, but not seeing any of it, trying instead to see into the heart of a Polish boy in Warsaw a lifetime ago, trying to reimagine who he once had been. And in time, a few iconic moments emerge from the penumbra, like tiny points of light in a wide dome of darkness, beams of a far-off search party coming to rescue him from the cliff face of autobiographical amnesia. Eventually, my father dies, and my father asked me to do two things for him. One thing for him, I beg your pardon, and that was to be cremated. And I was so concentrating on the funeral, on trying to arrange the funeral, that on the day after the funeral, because in Zimbabwe arranging a funeral is no easy thing, the logistics of it are very, very difficult, transport and everything else. And the day after the funeral, the guy from the funeral parlour called me up and said that there in fact hadn't been any power in the capital Harare for the last week. There'd been no power for about 5 or 6 days in that area of Harare, and the mortuary at the funeral parlour had been working on a backup generator, a backup diesel generator, which had now run out of diesel, and he couldn't get any more diesel. Diesel was in very short supply. And so the bodies were warming up, including my father's, and if I didn't come and collect it within 24 hours, he would have to give it to the Ministry of Health, who would put it in a big tipper truck and take it with all the itinerant and corpses that nobody claimed, and bury it in a mass grave outside town, otherwise it would be a public health hazard. So I quickly phoned up the single crematorium in Harare, which is called Warren Hills, and said, listen, I need to book to have a cremation. And the guy laughed at me and said, we haven't had butane gas here for nearly 2 months. There's no way we can do it. And so I tried to source butane to see if I could import it from Johannesburg, but I really only had 48 hours, and there was no way I could do that. And in desperation, I phoned up the Zimbabwe Hindu Society and said, listen, is there any way that I could be allowed to burn my father's body on a funeral pyre, like the Hindus do? And they said, no, you have to be a Hindu to do that, otherwise they get in trouble with the government. And I begged and wheedled and begged and wheedled, and eventually the chairman of the Zimbabwe Hindu Society said to me, he said, well, there might be one way. He said, but we would have to convert your father to Hinduism. So I said, okay, well, how are we going to do that? He said, well, it's quite easy, really. He said, Hinduism, basically, you just sort of, he said, you repeat this thing after me, and so I said, sure, and I said, and then can I do it? And he said, yeah, you can do it. So we went through this thing on the phone, by the way. We didn't. It was phoned in. That was a phoned in Hindu. And after I'd done it, I thought there was something wonderfully appropriate about my father, born a Jew, who then converted to Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, and then in death become a Hindu. And I thought, he's got almost all of his bases covered. Whatever happens, there's a bit of a problem with maybe if there's a Muslim God up there, but otherwise, he's got a pretty wide spread of religious insurance policy. So once I'd done that, I said, sort of, fine, where do I bring the body? And the chairman of the Zimbabwe Hindu Society said, oh no, you as the oldest son, you have to do it. And so I said, you've got to be kidding. He said, no. So they explained to me how to do it, and I will just read to you my final thing, what it was like. Basically, you have to construct it. It's quite complicated. You have to construct a funeral pyre of different kinds of woods and things, and this is how I buried my father. My father is now more than an hour late. We sit on a mossy stone bench under a giant fig tree waiting for him. We have finished the little Chinese thermos of coffee that my mother prepared and the sandwiches. Tapera looks up. The motion pleats the base of his shaven skull into an accordion of glistening brown flesh. At last, he says, he has arrived. The car, long and low and sinister, glides slowly towards us, only the black roof visible above the reef of elephant grass. It passes us and then backs up into position. Keith jumps out of the passenger side. Sorry we're late, he says. We were stopped at a police roadblock up on Rotten Row. They wanted to check inside. Can you believe it? He hands me a clipboard. Sign here and here. The driver reaches down to unlatch the tailgate. It opens with a gentle hydraulic sigh. Inside is a steel coffin. Together we slide it out and carry it over to the concrete steps. Keith unlatches the lid to reveal a body tightly bound in a white linen winding sheet. Why don't you take the top, he says. I ease one hand under the back of my father's head and my other arm under his shoulders, and I give him a last little hug. He is cool and surprisingly soft to my touch. The others arrange themselves along his body, and on Keith's count, we lift it out of the coffin. We shuffle up the concrete stairs that lead to the top of the iron crib. We have woven fresh green branches through its black bars, and on top of the tiers of logs inside, we have placed a thick bed of pine needles and garnished it with fragrant pine shavings. Upon this bed, we lay my father down. Gently, Tapera lifts Dad's head to place a small eucalyptus log underneath his neck as a pillow. As he does so, the shroud peeks open at a fold, and I get a sudden, shocking glimpse of my father's face. His jaw grizzled with salt and pepper stubble, the little dents on his nose where his glasses rested. His moustache, slightly shaggy and unkempt now, the lines of his brow relaxed at last in death. And then, as his head settles back, the shroud stretches shut again and he is gone. Tapera is staggering up the steps with a heavy masasa log. He places it on top of the body. My father exhales one last loud breath with the weight of it. It is necessary, Tapera says quietly, to hold the body down in case he pauses to think if there is a way to save his delicate